Today's session for Fundamentals of Management, we're going to talk about barriers to effective communication and overcoming barriers to communication. So before moving ahead, let's discuss what are barriers. Barriers or obstacles to communication causes breakdown, distortion, and inaccurate information. In large organizations, there are a number of obstacles which make transmission of message more difficult. In both upward and downward communication, it may happen that some of the persons in the intermediary layers withhold the whole or a part of information with themselves because they may feel that by withholding the information they will be in a better position than those they'll be in a better position than those whom they lead. It should be noted that although there is no such thing as perfect communication, yet considerable degree of perfection can be achieved in communication if the barriers of communication are overcome. Moreover, we should note that these barriers can occur at any stage of communication, whether it is a sending stage, transmitting stage, receiving stage, decoding, encoding, and so on. For example, the sender may not be audible to the audience, or he may not properly convert the intended message into signals. It can also happen the choice of channel for transmission may be faulty. Thus, the point at which communication barrier occurs should be properly identified so that remedial action can be taken at the earliest. So now, moving on to the barriers of communication, we'll be first discussing the first barrier, that is due to organizational structure. The organization structure has an important influence on the ability of the members of the organization to communicate effectively. These days, the organization structure of many big enterprises is very complex, involving several layers of information, supervision, and long communication patterns. Organization structure creates problems because communication may break down at any level of supervision due to faulty transmission. The second barrier to communication is due to status. Status of an organizational member is determined by the position he holds in the organization. This fact is quite apparent when the subordinate talks to his superior. Obstacle in communication occurs when the psychological distance between the two is created because of status of symbol of the superior. It creates a sense of inferiority complex in the mind of the subordinates, and because of that, he does not seek clarification from his superiors. The third segment of barriers are semantic barriers. Semantic is the science of meaning. Words seldom mean the same to two different persons. Symbol or words usually have variety of meanings. The sender and the receiver have to choose one meaning from among many. If both of them choose the same meaning, the communication will be perfect. But this is not so in this real world because of difference in formal education, qualifications, and specific situations of the people. Strictly, one cannot convey meaning. All one can do is to convey words. For example, the word profit may mean to management efficiency and growth, whereas on the other hand, for employees, it may suggest excess of funds piled up through paying inadequate wages and benefits. The fourth barrier is filtering of information. Sometimes the sender screens the information for passing only such information which looks favorable to the receiver. This is because of the simple reason that no one wants to show his mistakes, especially to his boss. The boss, on the other hand, wants to obtain information what is actually going on, especially to those actions which require his attention and priority. Next barrier is perceptual efforts. A person's perception is determined by his needs, social environments, level of education, cultural factors, and so on. Every person tries to interpret the information he receives from his point of view or from his angle. This may create complexities in the process of communication. Thus, effective communication requires the willingness to see things from the eyes of other person. Next barrier is closed mind. Premature evaluation by the listener also creates hurdle in communication. If the listener has closed mind, he'll always evaluate things from his point of view and will be non-receptive to new ideas. Next barrier is lack of ability to communicate. All persons do not have the skill to communicate. Skill in communication may come naturally to some. However, an average man may need some sort of training and practice by way of interviewing, public speaking skills, and so on. Next barrier is inattention. The simple failure to read bulletins, notices, minutes, and reports in a common habit of is a common habit of many people. Similarly, verbal communication has the impact on those who are preoccupied or unwilling to listen. If people do not pay the required attention to the listening and understanding of the message they are supposed to receive, communication will lose its purpose. Thus, the sender may then learn to be different. The next segment of barriers is resistance to change. It is a general tendency of human beings to maintain status. When new ideas are being communicated, the listening apparatus may act as a filter in rejecting the new ideas. Thus, resistance to change is an important obstacle to effective communication. Sometimes organization announces changes which seriously affect the employees, for example, the change in timing, workplace, order of work, installation of new plant, and so on. These changes affect people in various ways, and it may also take time to understand the full meaning of the message. The second barrier is of situational factors which may arise due to specific situations like physical conditions, like noise, insufficient light, information overload, and so on. When there's a lot of noise and when a number of people speak together simultaneously, communication can be ineffective. And if an executive is overloaded with a lot of information and does not have time to organize the same, he will not be able to communicate effectively. And the last segment is miscellaneous barriers. In addition to the stated barriers, there may be various barriers such as unclassified assumptions by the sender and the receiver of the message, emotional reactions, irrelevant messages, lack of trust, and so on, which formulate the part of miscellaneous barriers. So these were some set of barriers which create hindrance in the process of communication. Now we will be discussing the various measures. Now we'll be discussing various measures to overcome these barriers to communication. An effective system is one that ensures smooth flow of information in the organization and overcome barriers to communication. Such a system can have the following stated characteristics. Number 1, free flow of information. The system of communication should be so designed that it has short lines of information flows. There should be free movement of information both vertically and horizontally. The rigid organization structure does not allow to come in the way of smooth and speedy flow of information. Moreover, concepts like delegation and decentralization of authority should be encouraged in the organization for effective decision making and timely decision making in the organization. Positive attitude is the second measure to overcome the barrier to communication. The attitudes of superior and subordinates should be positive, that there is open communication at all times and at all levels of the organization. They should overcome the barrier of status to create proper understanding. The superiors must keep the subordinates informed about the policies, programs, and should also keep in touch with the subordinates regarding their problems, grievances, suggestions, and so on. This is necessary to achieve the organizational goals effectively. The third measure is clarity of message. The message must be clear as possible. There should not be any ambiguity in the same, and the message can be conveyed properly if it is clearly formulated in the mind of the communicator. The message should be encoded in very direct and simple language so that the receiver can understand the same. Next measure is open mind. The parties to communication must have open minds. They should not try to withhold information just to serve their personal interest. They should be able to interpret the information without any biasness. Without such biasness, they should also be receptive to new ideas that may come across, and they should not react before receiving and understanding the message completely. Next is communication skill. Every person should have necessary skill to share information with superiors, peers, and subordinates. This will improve human relations in the organizations also and will ensure higher productivity. Effective listening is the next measure. The sender must listen to receiver words attentively so that the receiver may also listen to the sender at the same time. It also necessary for every employee to upgrade his knowledge by reading companies' notices, bulletins, reports, and so on. The next measure is receptivity to new ideas. The employees should be prepared to accept new ideas and changes in the organization. They should be willing to receive information from internal and external sources which calls for change in the organization. The second last barrier is of flexibility. A good system should be flexible enough to adjust the changing requirements. It should be able to carry extra load of information without much strain, and it should absorb new techniques of communication with little resistance. The last measure is of reliance on feedback. Feedback refers to transmission of information concerning the effect of any act of communication. Its purpose is to reinforce or correct the action implied in any act of communication. Thus, we can say that feedback also provides an opportunity for suggestion and criticism. So, these were all the measures that we can implement to overcome the barriers to communication. One thing more we need to take into consideration are the principles of communication, which will definitely help us in effectively communicating in the organization. The first principle is principle of clarity. The beginning of all communication is some message. The message must be clear as possible and there should not be any ambiguity. The message can be conveyed properly only if it is clearly formulated in the mind of the communicator. The second principle is principle of purpose. The communicator must clearly know the purpose of communication before he actually transmits the message. The objective may be to obtain information, give information, initiate actions, change another person's attitude, and so on. If the purpose of communication is clear, it will enable the sender to choose the right mode to communication. The next principle is of understanding. Understanding is the aim of any communication. The communication must create proper understanding in the mind of the receiver. Principle of consistency means that the message to be communicated should be consistent with plans, policies, programs, and goals of the enterprise. This will increase the credibility of the message and promote better understanding. The message should not be conflicting with the previous communication. It should not create confusion and chaos in the organization. Next is the principle of completeness. The message should be complete and adequate, otherwise it will be misunderstood by the receiver. Inadequate communication delays action, spoil good relations, and affect the efficiencies of parties to communication. The second last principle is of feedback. This principle calls for making communication a two-way process and providing opportunity for suggestions and criticism. Since the receiver is to accept and carry out the instructions, his reactions must be known to the sender of the message. The latter must consider the suggestions and criticism of the receiver of the information. But feedback principle is often given a backseat by most of the managers, which defeats the very purpose of communication. And the last principle to communication that we must adhere to is of time. Information should be communicated at the right time. The communicator must consider the timings of communication so that the desired response is created in the minds of the receiver. So these were the 7 principles that we need to adhere while communicating effectively in the organization. So after this discussion, I think we are able to recollect that communication is a two-way process which bridges the gap between the encoding and the decoding process and establish a common understanding between the sender and the receiver. We can also state that effective communication may lies with the communicator itself, and feedback is an important ingredient in the message. Ensure getting and using it effectively for better performances. Thus, communication should be made effective so that the desired results are achieved in the organization. So this was all about today's class. Thank you so much.